All right, ready to go. So welcome everyone to Translation Reading the World with literary translator Jesse Lee Kercheval. So this workshop is sponsored by Straw Dog Writers Guild. Straw Dog is a nonprofit, volunteer-run writing organization in Western Massachusetts that provides programs of all different kinds. Whether you are a new writer or an experienced writer, you will find something here that you can use. My name is Michael Favala Goldman. I am a poet and a literary translator, and I volunteer with the Straw Dog Program Committee. I'm going to announce a few upcoming events and then turn it over to Jesse Lee. So let's see. Every Wednesday, Straw Dog hosts Straw Dog Writes, which is 2 hours of community writing and meetup time. It's hosted by Stephen, who's actually here on your screen. So that's every Wednesday. It's free, and you can get the details on the Straw Dog website. On the second Sunday of the month, there is an online open mic. You bring 3 to 5 minutes of your work, and you can read with a really welcoming community of other writers. You can see that on the Straw Dog website too. I run poetry critique meetups it's also on Zoom, virtual, and you can sign up those there too if you are writing poetry, and there are still a few spots open in December. For anybody in Western Mass, just a quick heads up that Ed Orzechowski is reading from his new book today at the Florence Civic Center at 1 o'clock. The book is called Becoming Darlene, and it's about a woman growing up in the Belchertown State School. And he's an incredible writer and a really good reader, so highly recommend that. And so now for today's program, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jesse Lee Kercheval, who is a poet, a writer, a translator who specializes in Uruguayan poetry, although she does many other things too. She's written 6 books of poetry, most recent from last year, I Want to Tell You. Her translations include Love Poems by Idea Vilariño and The Invisible Bridge, Selected Poems of Circe Maia, for which she was awarded an NEA grant in translation. Jesse Lee is the editor or co-editor of 5 anthologies. She serves as the Zona Gale Professor Emerita of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also the editor of the Wisconsin Poetry Series from the University of Wisconsin Press. So let me turn it over now to Jesse Lee Kercheval.
Hello, everyone. Well, we have a nice sort of small screen, so I'd like to go around really quickly, and you can just say, who you are, and which is sort of obvious because you have a name tag up, but sometimes people have different names from some other account. And if why you're interested in translation, if you have any experience in translation, just kind of a check-in, because I planned this in a broad way for people who have no experience in translation, and also interesting questions for people who've done a lot of translation, I think. So I'll just call out. Let's see. We know that Michael does translation, so let's go to Stephen.
My name's Stephen D. Brewer. I live in Amherst, Massachusetts. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a fluent speaker of the language Esperanto, and I've written several chapbooks of Esperanto haiku in both English and Esperanto, that is written in Esperanto, translated into English. I've also done some translation of other poetry, including Emily Dickinson, into Esperanto, and I've written a number of other kinds of poems in Esperanto as well.
Wow. Anna?
You didn't me?
Oh, hi.
Oh,
is that me?
Is there other one? Anna Smith.
Oh, Anna Smith. Hi. Let's see. I studied French and Spanish in high school, and then Russian briefly at college, and then went for many years studying Tibetan. And that was my only experience really trying to translate things that hadn't already been translated by someone else. Now I am mostly interested in translation as a way of, in choral music, I'm frequently singing in other languages, and we're faced with lots of different translations, and the whole idea of what makes translation worthy and how to do it in a way that is helpful for the people who don't know the language already and are hearing it in English. They're stuck with English, as I would say. So, is deeply curious to me. I mostly write essays now, and I've been interested in that as well. But I feel like translation is kind of the core of my of what it is to just be trying to get something over to somebody. And even if you're speaking English, I feel sometimes like I'm translating. So anyway, it's just about being from one side of something to another. So that's it.
Great. Linda Jo?
Good morning. I have an interest in both poetry and many languages, and I'm just curious about the whole process. I was recently to a reading of a translation of Oregon poet laureate Kim Stafford's A Proclamation for Peace. It was translated into 50 different languages, and there was a reading where a panel of people read it in different languages, and also talked about how difficult it was to translate some of the words from English. English being a language of colonization for a lot of people, and so that just really got me thinking about translation and, you know, what can I do with this?
Susan?
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm a fiction and poetry writer. And recently I started to, I'd say over the past 4 or 5 years, I started to get into Italian poetry, Dante, Petrarch, and all that. So I started looking into translating the words. I don't speak very good Italian. I'm better in French. My husband is French, so I've been surrounded by it for over 20 years now. So, you know, I could translate French, but as far as Italian, I'll have to, you know, go further in that. I'm also interested in the classic languages too. So I've been kind of dabbling in Latin. I'd like to dabble in Greek. So my interests are wide, and I'm kind of just starting out and diving in right now. So I'm interested in this workshop. So thanks.
Okay. Yenna?
Me?
Did I pronounce that right?
Okay. I'm Yena Yi. Actually, I feel like I was interested in this workshop because I kind of feel like I am living in translated world. My native language is Korean, and then I went to German and English. So surprisingly, I mostly write in English now. I've been here over 50 years, but still some things are kind of sort of somewhere it's kind of in a fog. I cannot but I did write my memoir in English, and then I self-published, I guess, about 4 poetry books. So I find that so when I was German being my second language that I spoken fluently, and at that time when I was reading Goethe and then the translation and from English, and it was just astounding. It's really interesting because in German, why it was interesting was because it actually rhymed. But then when you translate that, it no longer rhymes. So it's like, okay, how do you find this some kind of a sing-song type of poetry thing? But I guess it comes in different shapes.
Sharon?
I think you're muted, Shara.
Even though it shows you're unmuted, I can't hear you.
She's not muted, but the microphone isn't working.
Yeah, somehow the mic's not working for you right now.
Okay, we'll go on, and maybe if you can fix it out, I'll come back around. Sylvia?
Hi there, I am Sivia, and I have fallen into translation quite by accident. I've been obsessed with writing. Somebody told me I should stop saying obsessed. I've been immersed in writing poetry about a story from the Bible, the Sarah Abraham Hagar story. for many, many years. And I have been wanting for a long time to be able to do my own translation of it, to read it myself from the biblical Hebrew. I have minimal Hebrew, very minimal Hebrew skills and zero biblical, but for the past 8 months or so, I've been studying biblical Hebrew with the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is hysterical because I'm in there with a bunch of rabbinical students and I'm very illiterate in Hebrew. And so I'm actually doing a poetic translation of these stories in Genesis. So I've been in this world of translation, but briefly, but I have been loving it. It's amazing, especially in biblical Hebrew, where there is so much nuance, variation, ambiguity, and also power and history in every single word. So it's just absolutely fascinating.
Wonderful. Matilda?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I removed the audio because I have a little dog who doesn't like me to be on the screen. I've been translating for 23 years. I live in Florence, and I got into translation because it was my husband, actually. He found this course. It's a competitive exam. In Italy, you do competitive exams to get into courses. And I did a competitive exam to get into a translation course. And it was a 1-year course. And it was actually into Italian. So I was the only Canadian there. And then afterwards, I just started translating. And then I did a lot of academic stuff, I guess, for a lot of years. And then just kind of weaned, I guess. And I started teaching. So I've been teaching since I have been in Florence. And then, I don't know, I just kind of got out of translation because they don't pay very well in Italy. And then AI came along, and then, I don't know. I guess I always hoped I would get into literary translation because, I mean, the commercial stuff is okay. I mean, you do it, right? It's a way to make money and you make experience, and that it's okay. It's fine. But I was kind of hoping that it would go, a different way. And I published a lot of stuff abroad, like 16 times asymptote and lunch ticket, and I don't know, all kinds of places. But it just never worked, sort of. I'm not a social person, sort of thing. I don't like to go to fairs. I'm not good at rubbing shoulders. I'm really bad at querying, and I don't know. And now I have a difficult situation at home, and I've been sort of blocked for a while. So when I saw this today on your Blue Sky, I thought, oh my God, well, just take a minute for me, right? So that's
great.
it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Felice? I don't know if she's there. Did you solve your microphone problem, Shara?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can
Oh,
hear you.
Okay. It's been wonky lately. I don't know what's wrong. I'm from Chicago. I translate from French to English, but I'm relatively new to translation and always feel like I can stand to learn a bit more.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'm newer to translation than Matilda, for example. So I've been a poet all my life. I was born in France. My first language was French, but I never thought to translate from French poetry, though it's been a big influence in my own poetry. And then when I was 53, I decided that I was going to learn Spanish. My daughter was studying Spanish. We went to Mexico for the holidays to go to one of the language schools where you stay with a Mexican family and show up and they sort you into classes. And I was in the class learning my colors and numbers because I had never had Spanish. And I just fell in love with it. I actually just had an essay come out in the American Scholar about how when I learned the word verde, it seemed like, the world lit up. Like I'd worn out green and here I had a new word for green. And then I took a sabbatical year and went to Uruguay to study Spanish in a quite random way that had more to do with having to put my 12-year-old boy in school than knowing anything about Uruguay. And I didn't know, for example, they speak a very strange kind of Spanish there, Rio Platense Spanish that has all kinds of strange vocabulary. And that's my Spanish. And it turns out that as I began to translate, because I began to meet poets there who just wanted to be translated, it's a very small country, and they want to, reach out. and the poets all wanted to be translated. My first project was an anthology called Emerita of 22, I think, I lost count of how many, poets under 40. And each was paired with an American poet translator. And like 10 of them have gone on to have whole books. It was a wonderful project. But that's when I began to realize that I had, that's when people had much more experience than me translating, began to have trouble with the Uruguayan Spanish, I began to realize how strange a Spanish it is. We'll talk a little bit about that in one of my samples. I've set up this so that you don't need to speak Spanish at all, even though the samples are Spanish, and you don't need to have done any translating, because it's just to highlight some of the questions that come up in translation. You know, Matilda mentioned the difficulty in making money at translation now, translating prose. It's a real problem. I would say that translating poetry is mostly free of that problem because there's absolutely no money in it. If you think there's no money in writing poetry, there's no money in translating poetry either. There are a few exceptions to that, but mostly people find a poet that they love. I know ones who are deceased that I translate in Uruguay. And people tend to talk about the poet they're translating like, you know, showing you their baby bird. And it's just very sort of personal work. And that's a beautiful and lovely thing. It's not something I can look in the eyes of my students and say they can make a life out of, but it's a beautiful practice to have alongside your poetry. I don't translate prose except when I have to translate an introduction to a book or something like that, and then I'll throw myself into it. I think that for me, prose is too many words. And after a lifetime as a poet, people always say poetry is harder to translate. To me, it's easier. And you can see it on the page. You can think long and hard about each choice you make. The first thing I'm just going to show us is one of the things about translation is I think there's this idea that there's somehow a perfect translation. It's certainly behind the idea out in the world that there'll be a machine that can translate things, you know, that someday Google Translate will be so good that we don't need humans. But the truth is that every translation is really quite different. And one of the themes of today will be how different they are. And it's the choices that the translator makes. And this is even in a language I almost think of as a baby translation language, Spanish to English, that there's so much in common. You know, half the vocabulary in English is Latinate, and the grammatical structures are almost, you know, so similar. And so to translate, for example, from, you know, Korean to German or Arabic to English, those are leaps that require almost automatically the kind of decisions that I'm going to urge you to think about in these two similar languages. So the first one, and I have to say, I am not going to read in Spanish today. Oops, let me unshare. I have to get my document up first. I'm going to put things up in Spanish, but I will not torture you with my Spanish. And so I'll put this first poem up for a minute in Spanish, and then we'll move on to the English. This is an early poet it's sort of I want to say the Uruguayan Emily Dickinson. Now, is that about the right size to see on your screen? Too big, too small?
Looks good.
Looks good. The Delmira Augustini. I have her dates in the other manuscripts. She's born early, I think it's 1897, and she died young. She was actually murdered by her husband, or murdered by her soon-to-be ex-husband, because she was leaving him, and it's an early femicide and a tragic story. And she's probably if you live in the Spanish department, the best-known Uruguayan poet. And so we have her poem here, Fiera de Amor, and I'll just point out to it as I scroll down without actually torturing you with reading it out in my bad Spanish accent. What's obvious that you have so much in Spanish and is so much easier to do, which is rhyming. So we got instinto, plinto, sabor, emperador, piedra, piedra. You know, and so this is what we're going to see again when we look at the two different English translations. One of the great things about translation is you can make a decision about whether to stay close to the language of the original. For example, when I used to have to teach hordes of unhappy sophomores, which I haven't had to do in a long time, but I was a graduate student at Iowa, they would give us a list of literature to teach. And almost everyone would pick a Greek play over teaching Shakespeare, in this introductory literature trot through the entire, the history of literature, because it would be in a modern translation. They just didn't want to make the students have to read the Shakespeare. I mean, I love Shakespeare, so I made him do the Shakespeare. But I thought, wow, that's just amazing because, because the Greek is so far away that they're not going to try to translate once recently by the poet Anne Caston. And there's not an idea that there's some kind of particular English that they should be translating to. When I go to see Shakespeare performances in Uruguay or in any other Spanish-speaking country, poets are always retranslating. Half my poets have in their bios that they've translated Shakespeare, even though most of them don't speak English, and they translate it into modern English. They don't translate it into Cervantes. They just go with it, and that is a kind of wonderful freedom that we feel blocked from in certain situations. So with a historical poet or a poet who's writing in rhyme or sonnets, you can make the decision to translate it formally, or you can make the decision not to. Sometimes I feel people, for example, I'm doing an anthology now. I have this giant anthology of 55 Uruguayan women poets born before 1940 that was published in Uruguay, and I'm getting translators to bring it into English. And some of the poets have never been translated into English. And so the early ones, I'd gone to the trouble to get some couple of translators who are really good at translating rhyme and meter, which is not me. But if it's someone like Delmira Augustini, who's been translated multiple times, honestly, if you Google her, you'll find many, many versions of her work. Then the more poets translated, the more you feel like, if I'm going to translate someone, again, it doesn't have to be the same. For example, there have been some recent really interesting translations of the French surrealists, like Guillaume Apollinaire, because he's been translated, you can't count the number of times he's been translated. So some people have started to say, well, I'm going to do a very disruptive translation. I'm going to try to make it look shocking again. I'm going to try to make it look like it was written by a crazy young person in France who was disrupting the system, and not, how the Impressionists now look like something you should have in a box of Kleenex. And so, and you can do that, a more radical translation, because you can say someone else can find the original. Now, let me pull up the two versions of the Delmira Augustini, and we can kind of look at them and see what you like, because it's not a given at all. It's not like one is better than the other, but they're just two drastic choices being made here. Yeah. Yes. I've somehow turned on AI companion, which I do not want. Let's share a screen. All right, so how are those? Can you see them? They need to be a little bigger?
A little bigger, please.
A little bigger. Oops, that's smaller. And move them over so you can see them. A little bit bigger. How's that?
Good, yes.
Okay. I often call on people to read something out, but they may be a little small on your screen, so I'll read the two different ones. And the first one's by Gary Rass. This is translation that he's actually doing. And you'll see which way he chose to do. A beast for love. A beast for love, I've hungered always after beating hearts, of breathing pigeons, vultures, deers, or lions' innermost parts. No other banquet tempted me, nor had so fine a taste. Hearts left my instinct ravaged and claws blunted, yet unfurled. When suddenly, upon a plinth, as from another world, the lifeless statue of an ancient emperor laid me waste. My keen excitement only quickened as sleep desire ascended this stone torso like a bolt of ivy fire. Up to that chest, apparently snow nurtured on display, I cried out to the yearn for heart I never would secure, within a form excluding glory, placid, grand, and pure. Its bold brow in tomorrow and firm feet in yesterday. Still clinging to his rocky breast, my hot, unbound desire comes close to bleeding ivy in a blaze of fervent fire. Since laying eyes on him, I dream of gnawing on that treat of statue heart, the choicest game these pretty claws can know. It's neither flesh nor marvel, but a kind of starry dough devoid of living warmth, red blood, and lacking any beat, yet filled with the essence of a superhuman passion's heat. And then by Liz Henry, we have a different choice. Fierce from love. Made fierce by love, I'm starving for hearts. Pigeon, vulture, dun deer, or lion, no meat tempts me more with exotic flavors. I blunted my claws and my primal drives, then set up on a plinth almost otherworldly, a statue dazzled me, an ancient emperor, and fed my eagerness over his stone body. My desires ascended like ivy lightning, sudden up to his chest, feeding on skin like snow. I cried out to his unreachable heart. Sculpture guarding his glory, most chaste, still and pure, his face towards tomorrow, feet rooted in yesterday. Everlasting my desire, I stayed pressed like a living, blood-filled vine, and since then dreaming, I devour a statue's heart, prey worthy of my gorgeous claws. It's not flesh, not marble, the stuff of stars, without blood, heat, or heartbeat. I devour it with deep, inhuman passion. So, what works for you? What doesn't work for you?
Can I start?
Yes, please do, Matilda.
I don't know if I mentioned I have a blog, right? So I've been translating poetry on the blog for 8 years, maybe. And the thing I always say, at the end, I always say, it's just my translation, it's what I think. Most Italian translations are like this second translation. They're paraphrased. I find that she's saying the same thing, but she's paraphrasing. When I taught in high school, we would do poetry, right? The first thing you do with a poem is you paraphrase it. You say, what are they saying? And then after you analyze what they're saying, then you go into the poetic devices and everything, right? And it takes away, I think, this is just my view, I could be wrong, but
there's no wrong or right here. Let me just assure you, there's absolutely no wrong or right here.
But I like to hear the music that's in the original. Like for me, poetry is music. It's like listening to a song. It has the same effect on me. I feel the same tranquility afterwards. It makes me happy, okay, like a song would. So if you take the melody away, then you're left with that. So that sounds harsh.
That's a very clear explanation of one half of the possibilities, and I could find myself agreeing with you. But there's the other side too. So anyone want to say that they really like the Liz Henry version better? Okay, Michael.
Unless was somebody else? Did somebody else want?
I don't know. I can't see all the hands. That's one problem about being in. Let's see. Let's do Michael, and then I'll scroll down. So if anyone else wants to talk, I'll see them. Okay.
Okay. Well, so I love the Liz Henry translation so much, and whereas I found the Gary's translation a little bit more clunky. There's some redundancies, like he was, and some of the words not, like the word dough, for example, I felt was kind of just didn't fit the tenor of the poem, whereas the stuff of stars, just slightly elevated. I feel like the register of the poem is much better and much clearer and cleaner in the Liz Henry, and the emotion is captured through every line and every word choice. So I feel like the Liz Henry is just so elegant, and so that was my preference. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to scroll down, and now people can chime in with anything. We have two stances, but people can be in between. I can see Shara, Tsenia, Yena. Anyone want to raise their hands? Maybe I go down a little further. Anna, Susan, Elise. Just unmute yourself and chime in.
It's almost like the first one was being so true to the details that not knowing the Spanish, or I'd be, hard pressed to say, but you're being very true to details. Starry dough, devoid of living warmth, red blood and lacking any heat. Whereas the other one, it's not flesh, not marble, the stuff of stars, without blood, heat, or heartbeat. So there's an argument to be made for both sides. I hear what you're saying. It's like, do we want this detailed accuracy, or do we want to just deliver the experience the way a person in English how we hear words in our vernacular. So, yeah.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. Yes, Susan?
I wanted to say, I know English is an uninflected language, so we always want to make things concise because of the nature of our language. We don't have all the verb, the genders and the verb conjugations like other languages have. So I would say Henry's translation is probably more true to English in that that's our goal, is always to make it concise. Whereas I think the Roz's translation is probably more trying to take into account the Spanish and almost like an intermediary between the two. So.
Yeah. Let me just throw out here a couple of thoughts, which is, and again, it's much easier to rhyme in Spanish than it is in English. So that's a problem with translating from Spanish rhyme. When we're saying that the languages are really quite different, that's a big difference. Another small one is that the vocabulary, the number of words in the English language is actually much higher. And so we have a kind of obsession with if you write poems with not repeating something, we always want to use a different word for it the second time we say it, that they just do not share in Spanish. They'll use the same word and they'll use it as the noun form, the adjective form, the verb form, if that exists. And so that also is a thing in Spanish that, you'll see and you'll think, they've just used the same word 3 times. That's being very faithful to the Spanish and shaking it up as being faithful to the English. Okay, so I could see people had hands raised. Let's see, Sylvia?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm not arguing for or against either one. I see the merits to both, but I am admiring the way that Liz Henry handled the rhyme. Let's see, the Rice's rhymes are a little bit more expected. Hearts and parts, unfurled and world is nice. Desire, fire, some of them are pretty expected. And in a way that reflects the Spanish because it's easier to rhyme, as people have said. But I really enjoy the rhymes, the subtle rhymes, and just word resonances that Liz Henry uses that seem very true to quote unquote rhyming in English, or getting the effect of rhyme even when things aren't an exact rhyme, like claws and stars, I think is really wonderful. And there were a few other that I really enjoyed. Sculpture and pure. Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm always struck by is the extent to which something gets localized. I mean, these are different translations and they can serve very different purposes. One might, for example, provide you with a lot more of the original flavor and the cultural context that in order to keep those in, you have to produce something that violates some of the principles of the language that a native speaker would use in that language. But that in order to preserve the flavor of the original, you'd need to keep those in. And so I think that's what we can see here. And it depends on what your goal is. I often like to avoid having things that are localized because I'm really interested in the cultural context and in the language that it came from. Although something that's more localized might be better at preserving kind of the experience of reading it, and as if it were written in your native language.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else? Well, I'm agnostic. I don't have a choice really between one or the other. I commissioned the Gary's because it's an historical anthology that starts with someone who's born in 1797 and the youngest person was born in 1939. And so I have made a decision to try and be a little more faithful to the poetical structure of the earlier poets, because I just think in this kind of anthology, which is historical, with 4 introductions by different academics and long bios and a bibliography, that kind of anthology, that's the approach I would take. On the other hand, I just prepared a special issue of the Atlanta Review, which is a wonderful literary magazine that once a year does one of their issues is entire country or group of people from a country in translation. of Uruguayan women poets, and that's going to run, up to the present, but has some of these older poets in it. And for that, I don't have the Delmiro Agostini in it because she's been done so much, but I'm tempted to take a more Liz Henry approach, because in a literary magazine where people are just picking it up and reading it for, I want to say in a contemporary poetry context, I might be tempted to go for something that is, I don't want to say more accessible, but really more accessible. It would just fit in better with the other poets that are there. On the other hand, I might make the other decision, which is say, okay, well, I'm going to have poets that are, wrote these poems this year, and I have a poet who wrote this in, 1910, and I want to show that the poetry in 1910 was different. Another reason why I might stick with a traditional translation when I'm sending something even to a literary magazine for this would be for a section, and I don't know, World Literature Today or something, would be because again, Agostini is available in very different translations, and so if someone wanted a more accessible one, they could look for that. But if I was doing one of my poets who is, for example, the oldest poet in the book, Patrono Rezende, is completely unknown, absolutely unknown, and much earlier than anyone thinks someone wrote poetry. And I would sort of want her to appear, I think, in her historical context. So those are editor's thoughts, and they come into translation thoughts, and there are all kinds of in between. So you see in every single line, you end up making a choice. And I picked these two because they're radically different, but they're, if you want to go out and Google this poem, there are versions that are sort of half steps in between with the different translations. Did anyone else want to say something more about this? How many people write? Linda? Yeah.
Oh, I just had a question. I wonder, because I haven't done translation necessarily, but would a given translator maybe make several translations of the same work just to see how it, like try to do it in the different styles?
I think people who translate would automatically do that. I mean, I picked Gary because he's a specialist in formal translation, so I didn't expect him to give me back one. But so I'm looking at it because I get from this point of view, I could have picked someone who would do something, like when I end up finishing signing the poets in this book, people have asked me, well, do you want formal translation for this person? And I think if you were doing it, I were doing it, if I suddenly said to myself, well, I really haven't done someone as far back as Delmiro Agostini or Patrono Rezende, I think I'll try it and see what works for me as a translator. I think I would have to try both. But there are people who have picked a path, who would always do a more modern translation, who would always do a more formal translation. And sometimes it's just as strange, again, for American Vertita, which is the very first anthology that I did, when I was just a baby editor of translations or translator myself. I had a poet who had a book of sonnets I really liked, and then he also had a book of prose poems. And I thought if I could find a good translator for the sonnets, I'd do the sonnets, but otherwise I'd do the prose poems. I mean, I only needed 3 poems of his for this anthology. And Jeffrey Brock, who's best known for, is an Italian translator, but also does Spanish, did the sonnets for me. But I didn't want, in that case, to have someone do the sonnets so they weren't sonnets if I had a different choice. I mean, in that case, because it's a young poet. And it's not that usual. Like American writing poetry, the Uruguayans escaped formal verse early and vigorously. Another reason to choose a more radical version, maybe even a more radical version than this one, than Liz Henry, if you wanted to say to yourself, Delmiro Agostini has been translated a lot. She was a very radical poet in her own age. I mean, she comes from an upper class family. She began writing this, what for the time was intensely sexual poetry. She married a working class guy and fled the house and was living with him, and then decided to divorce him and marry a rich man, and he murdered her. She went to spend the night with him and sleep with him, I assume, and he stabbed her and killed himself, or shot her and killed himself. I can't remember. But anyway, it's a very shocking tale of the time. And so you could also make, like I said, with the Surrealists recently, a decision to write a translation that would be more radical. Those things are usually announced that way. It's like, I'm going to really make it sound like she suddenly was alive now, and this language was even more sexual or even more vivid. that's a far choice, and one that, if it's not for a poet that's really super well known, I would say is more like a poem inspired by than a translation. But you can see the rationale in a poet who is also widely available in other versions. And like I said, with the surrealists, trying to make them shocking again would be the intent. I don't know. It's pretty sexual as is. All right, let me pull up the next thing. I'm going to stop sharing while I do that. Okay. I'm going to do one that's the opposite in a way, which is I had a very strange thing happen to me in a way. It was just amusing thinking about translation. Like, I think about it differently being an editor than doing my own translation. And I've been translated and my own poetry. And so there are different experiences with that. Like when I was translating, I would often be frustrated. Most of my poets don't speak any English. So if I email them about something or I WhatsApp them about something, we're having Spanish language conversations about whatever the heck they meant in this particular line that I cannot understand. An example of that would be a poet of mine who had a title of a poem, Madror, M-A-D-O-R. I can't spell it loud, M-A-D-R-O-R. And I thought it must be a name. You know, I looked everywhere for it. And because it's easier, this particular poet is very, like, usually if you ask her a question, she sends you back 5 dense pages of email that don't help. So I WhatsApped like every Uruguayan I know saying, what's Madror? Is it someone's name? Is it a reference to a character? Blanks. So I asked Tatiana Oroño, is her name. Wonderful poet. And she said it's mother and dolor, pain, put together. Madre dolor. And honestly, I couldn't find a single Uruguayan who got that. And I didn't get it. I ended up not using that poem in her selected poems, so I just dodged the question altogether. But it's, you know, it's a portmanteau word, and whatever I made up in English would also need some weird footnote. And I'll throw that out to you. I don't know. What would you, if you put mother and pain together, what would that word be? Suggestions? I mean, the obvious one is mother pain, but that is not as oblique as Madror. I don't know. I couldn't come up with one. If anyone can come up with one, I would pay you money for it. I just put that poem aside.
Okay.
But yeah, suggestion? Someone? Mother pain? Mother, you know, English wants to go for mother of pain, something very, but I would say that Tatiana's choice of that word is not usual in Spanish either. So sometimes you're trying to be as unusual in English. You're not trying to be more obvious in English than someone was in Spanish. If they're writing unusual Spanish, you don't want to normalize it by writing normal English. And that's another thing. I just translated this poet, Silvia Guerra, who is the most difficult poet I've ever translated. I co-translated it with another wonderful translator, Janine Pitas. Her stuff is so, I mean, it's not Ashbery, but it's Ashbery adjacent. And so the first versions were all too clear. You know, we would just decide what she was trying and saying and try to make her say it. And we had to go back and say, you know, really, you can't tell who's speaking. Oh, Mau Mommy, that's good. I like that, Maumi. That's good. That's really right about there. We had to go back and make it weirder, to let what was weird in Spanish be weird and somewhat incomprehensible in English. And there's a tendency as a translator not to want to do that, because you'll think someone will read it and think I'm a bad translator because it doesn't make any sense. But in Spanish, sometimes it doesn't make sense. All right, so then I had this experience where I was translated, I've been translated before. I was translated into, I have a book of poems in Slovakian, which I'm not sure what poems are in it. I guess I could Google all the titles and then I would find out. But I had an email from the translator who said, there's a line in one of my poems that says, she was the kind of woman who would have her only male cat fixed. And the translator emailed me and said, why does she want to have her cat repaired? And I went, oh, you know, no. And I wrote back, no, she's the kind of woman who would have her male cat castrated. That's what fixed means in English. And I was kind of, you know, that's the kind of thing where you're just suddenly shocked and you think, well, all the other things could be going wrong. And then I'm a poet. So about 30 minutes later, I thought, she was the kind of woman who would have her cat repaired was more interesting. And I wouldn't have cared if it turned out that way. And so sometimes when I'm asking my poets to be more specific, and especially the one poet that I know is also a translator and a professor in Texas and speaks perfectly good English, and she would not actually say anything. She'd say, it's your decision. It's your decision. It's your poem. The translation is your poem. I would get so frustrated with her. But then the other way around, I thought, yeah, okay, I'm totally there for having my poem in Slovakian say she was the kind of woman who would have her cat repaired. So this happened to me in a strange way because I have a book of poems that came out in Argentina and then in Uruguay, translated by a Argentinian poet, Ezekiel Seidenberg, who lives in New York and is like a madman of translation. It's a blog where he translates something every day. And I sent him PDFs or the actual books of all my 6 books that I'd have published in English, and he made a selection. It's a selected poems. This is the Uruguayan one. Un pez dorado no te sirve para nada. A goldfish buys you nothing was the title in Uruguay, and the cuerpo is la crisis es el cuerpo. The crisis is the body was the title in Argentina. But so remember, there's an Argentinian translator. He's translating from English into Argentinian Spanish very purposely. And I was pleased with that because my Spanish, Uruguayan Spanish, is also Rio Platense Spanish. They're really quite close. They're weird Spanishes that are very related. But he also went out and he found some poems of mine that had been published in magazines that had not made it into a book, is the way he saw them. And that was true in some cases, but he also managed to find some poems that I had written in Spanish for a little book that was published in Uruguay called Extranjera Stranger. It was my sort of first translation project. I'd written a series of poems about being in Uruguay and learning Spanish, and then I had translated them into English, and some of them been published in English in the United States. And I didn't send him a copy of that book because I wrote it in Spanish, and he found some and he retranslated them. And that's really interesting. So I want to show you this is not only an English question. So first we'll just look at the poem in English. Hold on a second here, I get it up. Correct, please. All right. Share. And then we can look at the 2 versions in Spanish. Okay, is that the right size? Can you see it? Too small.
A little bigger would be good, yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. The title in English is in Spanish too. The Uruguayans love the word "ya," which is pronounced in Uruguayan Spanish as "isha," and like it's sort of like every other sentence has the phrase "ya está." That is, oh well, in it, "ya está." Suddenly, there are peaches in the fruit stand by the bus stop on Boulevard Artigas, glowing in spite of the fumes of the buses of the men who are smoking, waiting for the 121. Each peach is the round, smooth breast of a virgin, not yet bruised by a rough touch. You would think the men would throw down their cigarettes, stare, but no. Only the women notice, clicking their tongues, counting their pesos. First one, then the other move closer. Not buying yet, they stand with their eyes closed, inhaling the sweet smell of summer, softly touching their breasts. And let's see if I can actually change what we're sharing without me getting out again. Okay, can you see that? No.
Yeah.
I think I have to exit share. Let's share it again. Okay, here we go. Now? And
Yeah, make it a little bigger again.
get a little bit. All right. So what I've marked, and I'll just talk about, is the differences in my version. Some of them are because Ezekiel's Spanish is better than my Spanish. You know, I wrote this when I was learning Spanish, and I was trying to live a completely Spanish immersed life. And so since I always write poetry, it didn't seem worth writing poetry in English when I was trying to think all the time in Spanish.
Can you click the little green button to make this full screen so that we can see it better?
Push the little green button.
Up at the upper left-hand corner of the window. If you push the green button, it'll make it full screen. There's a red, an orange, and a green button.
Green.
Red, yellow, green.
You know, I don't see
Up by the title of it's inside the window.
In the
I-
most upper left corner of your screen, most upper left, you know,
Yeah.
the dots that, yeah.
Green one.
Ah,
Yeah, there you
yes.
go.
Oh, of course. Believe me, I was looking in
There we
Zoom.
go.
There we go. Thank you for solving a problem. I knew that and forgot that. Some of them are where he knows something in Spanish that I don't know, because I was writing this when I was very beginning in Spanish, and people said, well, why didn't you your first practice of translation was translating poems you'd already written into Spanish? And then I didn't know enough Spanish to be able to do that, but I didn't write something in Spanish that I didn't know how to say, mostly. And some of the things are differences because Argentina and Uruguay do have some differences, and some are just the kind of random choices that we would make, any translator would make. So if you look at the first, I just highlighted the ones in on the left, the right hand side one is Ezequiel's. And for example, in Uruguay, a bus, a regular city bus, is called an omnibus. And in Buenos Aires, they're called colectivos. So he's translating it for Argentina. So the bus is, I'm standing at a parada de omnibus para la parada del colectivo. That's just a difference between the two countries. But for the kind of random reasons you choose words when you're writing a poem is the same thing when you're a translator. So I have chosen for, you know, I think in English it's shining, but I wrote it in Spanish first, resplendecientes, and he says brillan, brillan in other Spanish. Uruguay has j's, the y's, and the l's, brillan. So that's just a kind of the choice that we saw being made in the Delmiro Agostini poem, where you say, okay, what verb am I going to say? Am I going to say they shine? They're resplendent is really the difference there. They're resplendent in my version. They shine in Ezequiel's version. So it's a little bit more direct language, and mine is a little bit, you know, higher, more Latinate. Again, then we have colectivos. I have hombres that are smoking, and it's more Argentinian Spanish slang than Uruguayan, but you might use it, which is tipos. So tipos is just guys. So I have men standing smoking, and he has guys standing smoking. Then I've gone for seno, which is just, you know, the more sort of poetic version of breast, and he is tit, really, basically, la teta, you know, which is breast too. It's not just, yeah, it's tit. So again, he's going sort of for a little bit more informal language. About here, I think I'm deciding that his language maybe is a little more masculine than mine in a strange way. And then he's chosen a different word, a more formal, more colloquial word for bruise, and just a randomly different word for rough touching something, rugoso, toca rugoso, mano aspera. You know, so those, again, would be the kind of choice that any translator could make. You just kind of choose. You're going to say, is it going to be a rough touch or a abrupt hand? And then I had them, again, it's probably, I don't think it's a difference in maybe in my sort of more poetic language, even in English, but also probably a sign that I was still learning English and Spanish because I lean on the Latinate words. And so I have them lancing their cigarettes and, you know, just translated to English, and he has them throwing them. That's pretty much then down below we have, you know, we have tetas again instead of senos. And another chance where in Spanish and English, there's always the different order of words. And so I've used probably what's the more sign that I'm an English speaker. I say olor dulce, the sweet, the smell sweet of Verano. And he uses the sweet smell of Verano. I don't, you know, so those are, I want to show you in the Spanish, not because you necessarily get the Spanish, but just so we think that this is not a problem that we only struggle with in moving something into English. And you can see almost in a different language how much it doesn't matter really. It matters because it's different if they're tits than if they're breasts. But it matters less than, for example, if I had my cat repaired. So any responses to the differences here?
I think you really put your finger on it to say that it's more masculine versus more feminine. in terms of language that I can see that right off. I speak Spanish, or at least I studied Spanish for many, many years. And yeah, it reminds me a lot of in Japanese, you have the same sort of thing that women use a far more polite, reserved kind of language, whereas the men use very rough, elided speech. But I can get the same feel from these two translations.
Yeah, my daughter, who's fluent in Japanese, she studied it in college and just came back from living there for 7 years. First went as an exchange student in high school, and they, for random reasons, put her in an engineering high school, which was all boys. And she came back, she said she came back speaking teenage boy Japanese.
Yaore.
I have a question. I mean, to me, it's interesting. It seems like yours, the feel that I got, or the kind of underlying story that I got through the whole thing was of this recognition of the virgin, the goddess, or whatever you want to call it. And that the women are sensitive. They're having the experience. They're feeling themselves as this holy thing. And the men are missing it. And maybe that's not, at all what's going on there. But I'm curious, in his version, can you just say the last 3 lines of both of the versions? Can you kind of tell us what those are?
Inhalan el olor dulce de verano tocando suavemente sus senos, esperando el dulce olor del verano y les I have trouble with that word, I can't see it. Acaricía las tetas. That one I think is pretty random in its changes, except for tetas. Inhaling, I don't know, aspirating, I'm busy translating them into strange, Spanglish, isn't that much different. And
I don't know. I think inhaling feels to me like a more technical term, whereas aspirando has spirar, to breathe. So it's breathing in rather than inhaling.
Yeah, and so that one you might say is me choosing a word that is more of a cognate in English. So I'm have them inhaling, and he just has them doing something more naturally in Spanish. So, so that's true too. And so if I had sat down and gone over this poem in Spanish with Ezekiel, like when I was first writing it, I might have accepted many of his changes, saying, "Oh, thank you," because that you can tell that I'm not a native speaker, that I'm a beginning Spanish speaker. So some of the translations are that way, and then some of them are just different. I have to say, when the book was originally published in Argentina by Baja La Luna, which is a lovely press, but it was in the middle of the pandemic and I couldn't get a copy of it. And so when a press agreed to do it in Uruguay, I said, great, well, now I'll be able to get some copies of the book. And I just had them, they just agreed to publish it, and they took it as it was. And the people in Uruguay just hate the fact that the omnibuses are called colectivas. That is like the #1 gripe about the book. And that is the smallest thing. I mean, I don't know, I guess that's the equivalent of a book being published in England, and then before it's published in the United States, they go through and, make sure it says center and not centra, and, all the things that are different between British English and American English. But it has a little bit more of the Canadian versus US thing, because Uruguay has 3 million people and Argentina has 40 million people. And so they're just touchy about their big brother. And they don't really like that they didn't like it. So there's a note too, that you could wander into some problem in a translation for using the wrong word for bus.
Can you just say what the bottom line is in both of them, or just
Yeah,
roughly?
it's tocando suavemente sus senos. Let me see if I can make it even bigger. No, it doesn't want to do it while I'm in full screen.
If you mouse over
Tocando
the top of the
suavemente
screen,
sus senos, y the word I have trouble with, les acaricia las tetas.
And what are those? Can you just give a word for word in English?
Touching suavely, softly their breasts, that correct and that they caress their breasts, caressing their breasts, basically.
So the suavely word, that's such a that seems like such a difference to me. Putting that in there.
It is different, and I think caressing their breasts is a little more sexualized. I don't know if I would go back now. I would use suavemente. it doesn't mean suave like that's in English, but it's just,
Right.
softly. But, that's one I put an eye on as a writer and saying, if I were retranslating the poem into English, what did I use? And that's a good question. Let me look and see. Let me escape the full screen and look at the English version for a second. Me back. And I have softly touching their breasts in English, inhaling the sweet smell of summer, softly touching their breasts. That was my translation of it. So you can see, it's just like, I was recently part of there's a collective on my campus that does sort of group translation. In other words, we'd all be Spanish speakers. We're gonna do something like this at the end here. And I put something up and everyone translates it. And they usually do Spanish into English. And so for example, Sylvia Guerra, the poet I said was so hard. She's been on there, and it's a big Zoom of people from all over the world, and they slugged away at one of her poems. And that they wanted to do some of mine from English into Spanish. And so they were doing it, and I was on there. And on one hand, as a translator, I could give opinions. And as a poet, I kept wanting to say, it doesn't matter. There was a phrase in my poem that refers to a rat terrier, which is the kind of dog I used to have. But the only point in the poem really is that it's a small dog. And they just went down a real hole, whether they should say terrier raton, which is not a breed of dog in Spanish, or they should say there are other kinds of dogs that are similar to that. And they were just going on and on and on about it. And I felt like saying, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like terrier would be fine. Small dog would be fine. And so I was more radical as the author to realize that something hadn't really mattered in my poem. And they felt they had to be very respectful of it in a way that I thought was going to make the word rat the most obvious, like rat in the poem. So again, it's sort of interesting to just see it from different points of view, and me looking at basically my own translation of my own poem and thinking, I don't know, sometimes Ezekiel's right, sometimes he's just different. Let me go into one now that has a question in it that comes up again and again, and especially when you're doing younger poets, which is about slang. Screen. This is the poet that I only did one poet for that original anthology. Because I took all the 22 poets and I handed them out to other people, and I chose a poet, Agustin Lucas, who the two things that Uruguay thinks of themselves as being really good at, and one is poetry. It's really kind of a country that's just packed with poets. There's a popular song there about cafes full of poets writing on napkins. And the other thing that they're famous for is soccer players, football players. So they had won the first World Cup. So Agustin Lucas is the only, as far as I know, professional soccer player.
Can you make this text larger again?
So this is one that the question in it is about slang. So we'll go to the English language version. He is a poet who uses a lot of slang. Let me say something about the Spanish version first. And he uses slang that would be known, or it's just not even slang, it's just an expression. And then he uses a lot of slang that is from a system of slang in Uruguay called lunfardo. Lunfardo is kind of tango slang. It sort of starts around the sort of criminal gangs that were involved in tango, Italian immigrants, before tango became a sort of something for the upper classes. And it's continued. And like most slang, it changes meaning over time. A lot of lunfardo sounds like, when you translate it pretty literally, it sounds like people talking in a 1930s gangster movie. So in this poem, Rio Va, there's a particular word, plancha, which is about down in the middle. And I'm going to read the English translation, and then we'll go back to the couple of the problems that I just, they're just problems in this poem. I don't, it's not the one that was in the anthology. The ones that were in the anthology, I didn't conclude this one. And I still think there's some problems with this one, translation. This is why I brought it here.
Jesse Lee, can you make the text bigger?
Bigger, okay. When I'm screen sharing, I'm doing full screen, I don't know that I can. Let me get out of that and just try to do it
Oh, that's better.
Well, let me try to do it this way, and then I don't know if I can make it full screen again.
That's good.
And it just goes back to the same size in full screen. Let me keep it. All right. River runs. I'm entering the barrio. People are sitting outside smoking, hoping that it rains. I go deep into the barrio. Cobblestones, 1,000 springtimes, secret wandering strides, the barrio made poem. Lightning from the storm merges with the shadows. Future ex-con on the corner blends cumbia with old tango. In the background, the smell of weeds and earth. 3 fireworks part the cloud in 2. I do not have an umbrella, nor have I ever. The sidewalk takes care of me. So, first of all, there's a decision I made in this version to keep barrio. Barrio in Uruguayan Spanish is just neighborhood. You know, every neighborhood is a barrio, and all the neighborhoods, just like you live in Chicago, they all have names. Usually I live in Parque Rodó. Sometimes I've lived in Pocitos. To keep it, translates it over to the slightly problematic sense in English that a barrio is a Hispanic neighborhood and maybe a poor neighborhood. And so one of the ways and things I'm not happy about, but don't know if there's a solution, is I say I'm entering the barrio because in this case, Augustine is talking about a very poor, marginalized neighborhood. And so it's not untrue to the vision I want the poem to bring you, but it is a little problematic, you know, in the sense that I don't really want to use a word that I think has a negative connotation for, you know, racist and colonial reasons, basically. So, but I don't know. I'm entering the neighborhood just doesn't quite work because we use neighborhood mostly in a kind of suburban way. I mean, if like you live in Chicago, you don't. My daughter is living in Argyle now, which is a neighborhood there. But if in most American cities, you don't really apply the word neighborhood in the same way. And I couldn't come up with a different one. So I'll throw that out there. And then I'll mention the other 2 that are problematic. We just talk about them both. The biggest one is the word plancha. Plancha in ordinary Spanish is iron, like you iron clothes with, or iron like, you know, it's a grill, like in a restaurant, they have pollo a la plancha, you know, chicken on the grill, hamburgers on the grill. Clearly, there is not an iron that one irons clothes with, or an iron like one cooks chicken on, standing on the corner. And it's because it's a word of Lunfardo slang that is that goes back to the days when they took mug shots of people with a camera that had a glass plate camera. So they would put the glass plate in and take the mug shot, pull it out. You've seen that like in old movies. And so a plancha in a traditional sense in Lunfardo is someone who's had a mug shot taken. So they're a con, a thief, a criminal, an ex-con, someone who's been in jail. In this time period, which is already, the trouble with slang is it moves back in time. So this poem came out in like early 1980s. And when I asked Augustine to describe to me what the plancha standing on the corner looked like, he described to me a young man with his hair tipped blonde, wearing a t-shirt for a football team, expensive sneakers, and gold chains around his neck. And so he's describing someone who's a young man who's been heavily influenced by American rap music and videos and movies, and so is dressed basically like a black drug dealer. You know, his pants down around his halfway down his bottom, and big pants. And that has gone to South America and been picked up. And as in the United States, that could mean the person is indeed doing that. Students come to your class, they were dressed like that. I remember the 80s, kids in my class, they were not black and they were not drug dealers. It was just a style. But in this neighborhood, probably is. So I have to find a word in English that conveys that. But for example, when I've asked people before, I often take this to classes and show it to students, and they suggest things that just reinforce the idea that this is a black young man in the United States in this poem, in which case this kid is not Black and he's not in the United States. So they say things like gangsta wannabe. And so what I ended up having here in this preliminary version was future ex-con, the idea that he's just headed not anywhere good. And that goes back to the idea of his being, an ex-con, which would be or a thief, the traditional translation of the slang. The other things that I made a decision about, which are just constant that you have to make in translation, is whether you keep a word. Cumbia is a kind of music. I didn't want to translate it. You can find out what cumbia is, and so I kept it as cumbia. And then the big question in translation now is whether you italicize, whether you foreignize a word, or I just leave it like that. You could also leave it as cumbia and have a footnote if you're publishing in a book. Magazines tend to not like footnotes. So there's the problems with this. And I'll just throw it out there to talk about Barrio, what it does, what you would have translated plancha as, and the problems you get into with slang. Not only that slang is just hard to translate, but that it constantly changes in time, so that even in Uruguay, people wouldn't think the same things about the word now. Or with keeping a kind of music or food, or the name for something that really exists in that culture in the original language. There's the questions that are in this poem.
I'm curious about the title.
Well, Rio va, it could be river goes, the river goes, river runs. It has a metaphorical sense, like most poems do, and it's just, there's not a river in the poem, so it's
right.
It's things happen, but it's not a slang expression or a dicho, a saying. It's just something for the poem. So the runs is a little poetic. It really just goes, river goes. But that seems strange to me. And I guess when I was doing this translation in English, I could see other possibilities.
I might almost use like water flows.
Water flows. That might be true.
Over the bridge or something like that.
Over the bridge, under the bridge.
It would have that illusion anyway, because I think that's kind of the point. But you're right. It's I just thought it was really interesting because the title doesn't seem to, it only relates to the poem in a metaphorical sense.
I like water flows, and I'll mention a problem to you people often talk about with Spanish translation. So Spanish translation in the United States now is usually published, I'm holding something up you can't see, which is my hands next to each other. It's published bilingually, which is great. So the Spanish is on the left-hand page and the translation is on the right-hand page. That's great because so many people in English in America can read Spanish, and that makes it available in both languages. For me, it's great because if a book's published here, and it's the only book my young poets have had, or any of my poets have had, published or available in print, I can take copies down to Uruguay, and then it's useful to them there because it's also Spanish. But it creates a problem. This particular bilingual translations where people, what I call it, reading across the margins. And it means, I think, the Spanish translation has become much less free. So people would say, Rio va, water runs, water flows. That's not the same. Now, I'm not saying there's a reason not to do it, but I think there's a kind of weird rigidness setting into Spanish translation. You'll see it that people rarely change the line breaks, even though they might look weird because one will be really long in Spanish and short in English, or vice versa. Because people are sort of reading across the margin. They want the poem to look the same. Yeah. And you do not have this problem of translating from Hebrew into English or Chinese and Mandarin into English. It just goes out the window, even if it is published bilingually. And usually other close languages like French, Italian, they're not usually published bilingually. So it's a particular Spanish thing.
Yeah, it was really interesting to me. I do haiku. And so in Japanese, of course, everything is backwards. And so when you're looking at something in English translation of Japanese, the correspondence is they're like mirror images of one another, because the word order in Japanese is backwards.
Anyone have a suggestion about either plancha future ex-con or barrio? I would like to not use barrio, but I couldn't solve that one.
You'd use quarter. It's not really right either, though.
No.
Yeah, I'll just add the kind of the terrorism of the I don't know if that's the right word, or the oppression of the facing translation. You know, I totally have also you know changed my translation choices because I knew the original was over there. Whereas, you know, I would not break the line in that place, or I would have chosen, you know, a different word choice, but you know, the more direct one is okay. So I've also felt the pressure to make the translation a little bit closer, even if it wasn't my first choice.
Yeah, it's sort of the wings of the butterfly effect.
Yeah. What if you were to put it in italics, the barrio? That way.
Yeah, so
You're-
the question,
you're
I
referring
could
back-
very much, but there's two things about that. One is barrio, the word exists in English now. It's, you know, it doesn't need to be, it's not really a foreign word anymore. The other is, like I said, when I actually have cumbia in italics, it's really a hot source of contention in translation now, whether you italicize things, because it seems like a small point, but it's felt to be kind of colonializing in some weird way. Like, this isn't a real word.
Yeah.
It's the smallest typographical thing. And here, you know, some people would know what cumbia is because it's a style of music that's been a worldwide hit, but some people would not. And it's not the same thing as barrio, which does exist in English, but exists in English in a different way. Another example of that is in Uruguay, they have arroyos. They would say arroyos, but arroyos, and they are full of water. They are full of water all year round. And so when they appear in a poem, if I kept arroyo for some reason, people would see it dry, because we use it in, I think, a Spanish sense of the word, but certainly a American West sense of the word, where it's a river that only has water in it occasionally, or, you know, when it rains, and not in a pretty lush country where it's absolutely full of water and it's just one of the other words you could possibly use for a river. So, so sometimes a word that's made it across into English carries the other connotations. And this does with barrio, because we mean it to be, generally speaking, a neighborhood of immigrants, of Spanish-speaking immigrants, and that carries with it cultural connotations. So,
yeah, the two other words that I can think of for barrio, you could use ghetto, but that again has a different
carries-
cultural connotation. You could also use favela, which is starting to become well enough known in English, but again, that carries a particular cultural connotation as well.
Yeah.
it carries almost the
Portuguese and
same cultural
Brazilian.
connotation, and then also makes this seem like it's set in Brazil, which is
Right,
rough.
exactly.
Right.
So-
It becomes Brazilian. But I feel like neighborhood is the most neutral.
Yeah.
Really, you're trying to avoid our projections of
Yeah.
like, there's a lot of criminal activity going on here. If you just want it to be neighborhood, felt as neighborhood, it's the best I could imagine.
Yeah, I think that neighborhood it does carry this kind of suburban thing. And again, I'm just looking at it now and thinking, if I wasn't cursed with this sort of butterfly problem, you could solve it in a way by saying I'm walking down my street.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the street made poem. It's really often the way we use street, you know, especially this my street and the street with people out, that's your neighborhood. So, you know, so that's a bigger jump. The future ex-con, yeah, I just don't know about that.
Can I ask you something about that future ex-con? How is it? What does it sound like in the Spanish? Is it like?
It's
Does
plancha.
he mean to be kind of cheeky almost, or is it just
I
blatantly?
was trying to
what
get at the
they're
fact, and this is probably just too much digging. So if I asked a person
Okay.
who was my age what a plancha is, they would say they were someone who'd been in prison, an ex-con.
thug or something? Yeah, yeah.
And
Okay.
and so or a thief. But when I was talking to Augustine, he was sort of saying, like I would with my students who were, you know, dressed in this kind of mock gangsterish way at the time, that, well, he was young, hadn't really been in prison, but he wasn't headed anywhere good. And so that's a kind of complicated thing, future ex-con.
What
that
if you put something? Could you go crazy and put like apprentice con on the corner?
You could put Apprentice Con on the corner. You could put Apprentice Thief. He's actually selling drugs. So almost certainly he's selling drugs. So, you know, I could say, you know, the dealer on the corner that kind of gets away from the, you know, it's like I couldn't come up with a way that for, and again, it's a slippery slope for people of Augustine's age in the 1980s. Plancha brings up a pretty vivid picture of actually a very specific kind of person. And in prose, you could get away with throwing a bunch of adjectives in there, but you can't in poetry. And so sometimes you just think, well, I don't know if I can do that. I might just put plancha and put a footnote. Again, some places you get to have footnotes, some places you don't. But
it seems to me that his age is important, and if that didn't exist in the Spanish, but it seems like young drug dealer.
Yeah, I mean, or boy dealer. You know,
boy dealer. I mean,
but that makes it mean it deals boys, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Yeah, but the young seems important.
It does. It does. And you know, I'm showing you one because I just never did anything with this poem. I was digging around in sort of my, you know, uncompleted translations, failed poems file. Yeah, you know, and there are just other things that you do because it's a poem, which is, I think he has two different words for no, he's playing with the idea of yerba is there one of the words for pot, weed in Uruguay, and then the second time he's talking about it is grass. So I actually, in order to keep that, I said smell of weed, smell of weeds. You could say smell of grass, smell of grass. That's a little joke inside the poem. All right, I'm going to escape from this. I had one more for us to look at, but I don't really think we have time. So I think I'd like to throw it open to just general questions, discussions. I would say that everyone can translate. I have to say, you know, having started doing this, my first book of translations was published in 2016. So, you know, baby translator here, even though I've done to do a lot. And people who are hesitant about their language skills, I have translated things by myself, and I also co-translate things. I translated a Portuñol poet. Portuñol is not a written language, really, but it's the language that basically everyone speaks wherever Brazil touches a Spanish-speaking country, and on the inside too. It's a language of hundreds of years of tradition, but it's different in every place. And I had a poet who has taken a political decision to write in Portuñol. It's like the language of the frontier, and you know, it's undervalued. And he grew up with giant signs that said, you know, in this town that said, you know, parents, if you love your children, don't speak to them in Spanish. And so he published a book that was in Portuñol and Spanish bilingually in Uruguay. And I translated that with a Uruguayan poet who was a Portuguese professor. She did from the Portuñol and I did it from the Spanish, and we checked them against each other. But I often translate. Co-translating is great fun, and it's like playing badminton with someone, and you know, in a spirited way. And so that's a great way to get going on a project when you feel that that your language skills are not up to it. And I don't mean just going out and sort of like one classic pairing is you find someone who's just native in the language but isn't a poet or a translator, and you work with them. But just working with another person who has that language, at least you cover each other's holes, if nothing else, the deficiencies that you have.
Well, I'm just noticing how different the poetry with the side by side would be with prose, and that's, you know, Michael of course has done both, and I'm just thinking, I'm kind of curious, like, have you done much with prose translation? And I guess Michael could weigh in too. How different is that?
Well, I think it's quite different because you have a lot more freedom. I haven't done it, but you know, I now have tons of translator friends. I go to, I swear to you, the sweetest, loveliest academic conference in the entire universe, which is the American Literary Translators Association. It was just in Milwaukee. It'll be in Tucson next year, where people are just so warm and so helpful. You know, like 300 people who love their little birds. But the panels on prose translation definitely give you the feeling there's more freedom. Like I've heard more than once, and somebody could tell me this isn't true, but that the Spanish language version of 100 Years of Solitude doesn't start with the same sentence. And so certainly when you run into a problem like the problem with plancha, you could have dropped in 5 extra words to describe the guy on the corner. and that's not really considered a problem in prose. Poetry, yeah, kind of limited. Michael, do you have something to chime in with?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree. Poetry has more constraints. And in prose, you can't do whatever you want. I mean, you still have the register of the author, supposedly that you are that is your constraint. But if there's a cultural reference that can't be that you can't do in one word, it's okay to add one or two more, to help get that cultural reference across. So which in poetry, could be more sticky because of the line length and just keeping the lyricism. So more constraints than poetry, but that's part of the challenge.
Part of the fun.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Shara?
Two questions, I guess. One is, I've heard a lot, you should be a poet to translate poetry, and I wonder.
You don't have to be. That's hard. Speaking from my little patch, I felt like the strength that I brought to it was my knowledge, lifelong knowledge of poetry, but there are lots of people who translate poetry who are not poets. So in the United States, it tends to be a lot of poets translating poetry just because there's no money in it, whereas people who translate prose, often, professional translators, but professionalize, and they make their living from it. But, if I went to the went to Alta conference and said, everyone who translate their poetry raise their hands. And then I'd say, and everyone who is not a poet, drop your hands. That would be about 50-50, I think.
And my other question was about remorse. So I published something from prose that I later learned I totally misunderstood a sentence and like the entire meaning of the sentence I got wrong. It
happens to everyone, and it's why you wake up sweating. And I don't know, it's like, it's better if it's in a magazine than a book. You presume that it can be corrected in the book, but everyone does that. And I brought up the castrated cat incident to show that, everyone does that in every language. I catch a lot of them when people are translating from Uruguayan Spanish. Like there was one recently I was looking over for a friend where she had translated plantano as a banana tree, and actually in South America it's a London plane tree, American sycamore. So but if someone was walking down the street with banana trees, it would offend an Uruguayan. It doesn't exactly bring the poem to a huge crashing halt exactly. An hamaca is a children's swing, not a hammock in Uruguay. It's just these weird things. But if you had the children in the park playing in a hammock, would also not bring the world to the end. But someone would say something to you about it, and that's what every translator's great, waking up in the middle of the night fear. So.
I was just going to congratulate you for your courage for sharing your personal translations and letting us kind of deconstruct them like this, because it does bring all of your choices right to the fore. And it takes a lot of courage to do, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, and once I've never solved the problem. I give you examples where I cheated by just not ever doing anything with those poems. When you do an entire book, when I do selected, so you have 500 pages of someone's work or 6 books or something, you pick out the poems that you think work in English, that you think you got to work. But for example, I know Idea Vilariño's Love Poems, that's her most famous book. And, you just have to translate all of them. You can't say, whoops, no. So that's a different sort of challenge. Because you can't translate, you can't leave out a chapter or a paragraph or a sentence, presumably in prose.
I would just add that as any kind of writer, but especially as a translator, there's a couple. One trap is the trap of pride that, oh, I know how to do this and I've got this covered. And then there's this other trap of like humility. It's like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm afraid to show it to anyone. That both of those are like the enemy. And that collaboration, and as Jesse was talking about, finding someone who maybe, has better language skills than you in the original language, it's really essential to have editors, to have collaborators, to help try and reduce those cold sweats or whatever. That's like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But there will always be things that slip through the cracks, but having a team is just so beneficial. So
it really is. And because I know lots of Uruguayans, many of whom are not poets, I can crowdsource Maduro or Plancha. That's helpful too. One of the great things on the internet that's underrated is Google Images. So if you're saying, okay, is the Zorro in this poem the fox or a plant? Uruguay, a plant. You can often chase down something and save yourself from the hammock debacle. But so that's a way that you can use resources that just a very short time ago weren't there easily.
So I'm seeing the time, and I want to know. So, Jesse Lee, is there any final words before I wrap things up for us that you'd like to?
I think if you're interested in translation, you should try it. If nothing else, it really, really sharpens your own brain, whether it's brain to turn around and write poetry or just do something else. It's a great mental puzzle. But I do think it's true what Michael says is that, there's always going to be a better translation. I was actually in a beginning Spanish class, a Spanish 101 class. We're looking at the Circe Maia translations. And one of the students had a better solution to how to do subjunctive not subjunctive, to do conditional in the sentence that I had come up with. So you have to sort of think of it as like, okay, I'm learning to play the piano and I'm going to practice this piece. And eventually, if I get good, I will play this piece for other people. But there are also people who will go on and play this piece. I'm not the only person who will ever play this piece of Chopin. And although many of the poets I translate have not been translated before, and so I feel like the main thing is just get them known, get their work out there, get their names known. If people love their works, someone else will translate Idea Vilariño's love poems again. I feel that to be too shy about it just does this thing which I hate. I call this read the world, I think, because, if there isn't translation, we just exist in this little box. There's no perfect translation from another language, but that we can't read anything that was written in another language. That's insane. That's the world that some people would like us to live in, but it's not the world that I want to live in.
Jesse Lee, could you also say again the name of this conference that you mentioned?
Yes, and find the website. It's the American Literary Translators Association,
ALTA.
There's a bigger umbrella translators association called American Translators Association, ATA, which is an enormous conference. This is a small conference of people who are translating literary work, who are literally the loveliest people, who will do anything to help you. And it is in Tucson next year in October.
Highly recommend.
That's really good.
I've been to it many times too.
Yeah, we've been to this lovely place.
So I want to thank everyone for coming to the workshop today. Thank you, Jesse Lee, for this discussion of language and translation. Straw Dog Writers Guild has so much else to offer in fellowships, workshops, open mics, writing events, reading. So please check out the Straw Dog website, sign up for the newsletter, and stay in touch with our events every month, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Straw Dog. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much.